Hello, good morning. Welcome to Breakfast with Louise Minchin and Roger Johnson.
Our headlines for you today are back in the eye of the storm. There are now more COVID patients in England's hospitals than there were at the peak in the spring.
1,500 military personnel will help secondary schools and colleges in England to carry out mass testing from next week.
Good morning. Boxing Day onwards is supposed to be bumper in retail, but not this year. How the high street's been faring at the end of a roller coaster period.
Good morning. In sport, a coronavirus outbreak in the Manchester City squad forces the postponement of last night's Premier League match with Everton. It was called off just 4 hours before kick-off.
Good morning. We've got a wintry mix today of some rain, some sleet and some snow. There's also quite a lot of ice around this morning, so slippery surfaces and the potential for some travel disruption. I'll have more details in about 10 minutes.
Well, good morning. It's a Tuesday, the 29th of December. Our main story for you. Hospitals in England are now treating more coronavirus patients than at any other point in the pandemic, as numbers surpass the peak that was seen in April.
It once again shows the stress that the NHS is under, with the head of NHS England saying that health workers are back in the eye of the storm. Keith Doyle reports.
Health services across the UK are being stretched as they deal with increasing numbers of patients with COVID. In London, accident and emergency departments are reporting intense pressure. In Scotland, doctors say there's a danger that services will be overwhelmed. In Wales, the situation in hospitals is described as incredibly challenging. And in Northern Ireland, the health minister said the next few days is a crucial period. The stark messages show the impact the COVID virus is having.
I was on Christmas Day and it was wall-to-wall COVID. So we see patients who are coming in who have COVID symptoms, but we also see other patients coming in with other problems who turn out to be COVID positive. And between that, there is a great deal of difficulty getting those patients through into the wards.
In England, the number of people being treated for the virus in hospital is over 20,000, higher than the previous peak of around 19,000 in April, although more testing is being done now than it was then. Over 41,000 new cases were reported yesterday, a record with 357 deaths. NHS providers said some trusts were reporting up to 3 times the number of COVID patients than at the peak of the first wave. The pressure is having a real effect. In many hospitals, the rising number of COVID patients means staff are being redeployed and more routine operations and procedures are being postponed.
Sadly, it's inevitable that as the infections rise and the admissions rise, that actually we see disruption to other services. We're desperate, our members are desperate to keep that disruption as low as possible. But unfortunately, some of our elective and planned services will be disruptive, both in hospitals and in other settings as well.
Acknowledging the work that health workers are doing, the head of the NHS in England has given a message to staff who he said have had a very tough year.
By late spring, we think that with vaccine supply continuing to come on stream, we will have been able to offer all vulnerable people across this country this COVID vaccination. And that perhaps provides the biggest chink of hope for the year ahead.
Tomorrow, the tier levels in England will be reviewed. Across the UK, health ministers have pleaded with people to stay home for New Year's, sticking to the restrictions in place. The challenges for the health services over the next days and weeks are immense. Keith Doyle, BBC News.
So testing times for health workers. At 8:10, we're going to hear from 2 NHS staff about what it's like at the moment working on the front line.
Military personnel are to provide remote support to schools and colleges with coronavirus testing programmes as they reopen in England from next week.
1,500 armed forces staff from local response teams will provide telephone and online advice about setting up testing facilities, as Catherine Stanchesson reports.
As spring term starts next week, secondary schools should look different, with full coronavirus testing facilities on site. But setting them up is a big task. So big, in fact, that some education leaders have said it's simply not possible in such a short space of time. Now the Ministry of Defence has announced it's stepping in to help with that effort. In total, 1,500 armed forces personnel are being made available to support schools and colleges. They'll form local response teams, providing advice on the testing process and the setup of testing sites. It'll be mostly done remotely by phone or online meetings, but teams will also be on standby to provide help in person if needed. The majority of the tests will be carried out by the pupils themselves. The military has already assisted with other testing programmes around the country, including the mass lateral flow pilot in Liverpool. These fresh resources are part of the government's plan to get children back in the classroom through a staggered start post-Christmas, giving schools time to get prepared. It says physical attendance has to be a priority. But teaching unions and some virus experts have called for a rethink amid rising coronavirus cases, saying all pupils should stay at home to help prevent an even more difficult January. Catherine Stancheshin, BBC News.
In the United States, President-elect Joe Biden says his team is not getting the cooperation it needs from the Trump administration as he prepares to move into the White House. Mr. Biden was speaking after a briefing with national security and foreign policy aides. He criticised the Department of Defence for not providing key information to his team as it makes the transition to power. A defence spokesman said that the Pentagon had been completely transparent.
From this week, people aged over 60 in Russia will be offered the Sputnik, I think it's 5 vaccine, or is it V vaccine, named after the Soviet-era satellite.
700,000 doses have so far been released for domestic use. 68-year-old President Putin is eligible for the vaccine, but interestingly hasn't yet had it.
Well, let's get more information from our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg, who joins us now. So, Steve, tell us about the rollout. What more do you know? Morning.
Good morning. Yeah, well, Russian scientists and Russian officials have been trumpeting the effectiveness of Sputnik V. You hear all kinds of numbers being mentioned, that it's 92% effective, 95% effective. Vladimir Putin a few days ago said it was up to 97% effective. And that's despite the fact that the vaccine was controversially registered in Russia before phase 3 clinical trials were complete. Basically, the vaccine is made up of 2 entirely different injections delivered 3 weeks apart. And because they're entirely different, that makes it quite challenging to produce the kind of quantities that Russia would need. But this week, the Russian government said that it hopes that by the spring, 60% of the population will have been vaccinated. And it hopes that by then, the outbreak will have been brought under control.
Well, Steve, thank you very much indeed from a snowy Moscow. Thank you.
Hospital admissions for children with eating disorders in England have risen by almost a fifth in 2 years. That's according to new figures. NHS digital data for England shows that more than 4,500 young people were given treatment in the last 12 months. That's up by 19% since 2018. Doctors believe that the increase is partly due to the mental health toll of the pandemic, with children being isolated from friends, spending more time on social media, and no longer feeling in control of their future.
The Spanish health minister has said his country will set up a registry of people who've refused to be vaccinated against coronavirus and share it with other European Union nations. He said vaccinations would not be mandatory and the list of those who've refused to be inoculated would not be made public. About a third of all Spaniards have said they won't take the vaccine, though that number has been falling in recent weeks.
Now, vinyl album sales in the UK are at their highest level since the early 1990s. Almost 5 million vinyl LPs were purchased in 2020. That was up by 10% on last year. That's according to figures from the recording industry body, the BPI. The cancellation of live music events and an appetite for nostalgia during the pandemic are thought to be behind the increase in sales.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.